The Dismal Creek Incident by David Eden. Chapter 1. A Serene Escape. Ricky Williams awoke to the gentle songs of warblers and chickadees, their melodies drifting through the towering hemlocks of the Appalachian Trail. He stretched in his cozy tent, inhaling the earthy scent of pine needles and damp soil. His faithful chocolate lab, Willie, snored softly at his feet. It was day 3 of Ricky's solo camping trip near Dismal Creek in southwestern Virginia. At 54, he relished any chance to escape the stresses of work, city life, and the troubles of his past by losing himself in nature's simplicity. There was no better place to do that than this wild, picturesque corner of the Appalachians, where he could confront his inner demons in solitude. Rolling out of his sleeping bag, Ricky patted Willie awake. "Rise and shine, buddy. We've got some primo trout to catch today." Willie yawned and wagged his tail, seeming to understand perfectly. Ricky chuckled, grateful as always for his loyal canine companion. He couldn't imagine venturing into the wilderness without him. As they emerged from the tent, sunshine filtered through the forest canopy in shimmering beams, decorating the leaf litter like flecks of gold. The creek gurgled softly just beyond their campsite. Breathing in the cool morning air, Ricky paused to appreciate the restorative power of solitude surrounded by untamed beauty. But he also knew not to be lulled into a false sense of security. Though serene, this ancient mountain range had borne witness to many perils over the centuries. A wrong step, a twist of bad luck, and even an experienced outdoorsman could find himself at the mercy of an unforgiving backcountry. Making sure his knapsack was fully stocked with emergency gear, Ricky set off toward the creek, Willie trotting happily at his heels. His fly rod felt light and familiar in his hand, an old friend he looked forward to reuniting with each trip. They followed a well-worn path along the babbling stream, its clear waters tumbling over moss-slick stones. Delicate wildflowers dotted the banks, bluebells, trillium pink ladies' slippers. The sweet aroma of honeysuckle wafted on the breeze. As they walked, Ricky couldn't shake a feeling of unease, as if something wasn't quite right within himself, despite the peaceful surroundings. He hesitated for a moment, questioning his own intentions and stability, before pushing the thought aside and focusing on the crystal-clear waters ahead. In a sunny clearing perfect for casting, Ricky assembled his rod and selected a hand-tied fly that mimicked the silvery minnows darting in the shallows. He and Willie had subsisted primarily on freeze-dried camp fare so far. A fresh trout dinner would be a welcome gift from the creek. As Ricky flicked the line back and forth with a satisfying swoosh, allowing himself to sink into a focused reverie, his stomach growled. His thoughts turned to the dwindling supply of granola bars and jerky in his pack. Ricky hoped the fish would be biting today. If not, he took comfort knowing he could rely on the time-honored tradition of generosity among hikers. On the Appalachian Trail especially, a code of looking out for one another, of sharing food and supplies when a fellow traveler was in need, had brought many a hungry camper back from the brink. Still, Ricky was loath to impose on others. He took pride in his knowledge of the land's bounty, which mushrooms were safe to forage, how to set traps and snares for small game. Surely he could scavenge up a satisfying meal, even if the trout proved elusive. Hours passed in tranquil solitude, interrupted only by birdsong and the burble of the creek. A few silvery flashes beneath the surface raised Ricky's hopes, but none took his lure. Eventually, with a sigh, he collapsed his rod and called for Willie. The aging lab was snoozing in a sun-dappled patch, but dutifully hopped up to join his master. Ricky scratched him affectionately behind the ears. "Better lock at the next spot, aboard." They continued on, leaving one idyllic pool behind, only to round the bend and find another equally inviting. Ricky was in no rush. He had days yet to explore new fishing holes. Time became irrelevant out here, marked only by the sun's lazy arc overhead. That timeless quality was part of what drew Ricky to the wilderness again and again. Away from the hustle of civilization, surrounded by ancient hills and forests, he could imagine himself as just another creature moving through a landscape that had remained largely untouched for millennia. Here, his everyday worries and modern trappings fell away, revealing something more elemental. A connectedness to the earth and its non-human inhabitants, and to the generations of people who had walked this land before him. Of course, that sense of history had a dark side as well. As much as Ricky liked to imagine himself far removed from society out here, he knew the forest held secrets and scars left by human hands. These remote hollers hadn't been spared from violence and tragedy over the years. In fact, Ricky had read about an unsolved double murder that took place in a remote camping area a mere 2 miles from where he now stood. The crime had a ritualistic undertone, hallmarks of a killer who fancied himself some kind of mountain man mystic. Authorities at the time suspected a local loner, a hunter named Randall Lee Smith, who was known to be unstable. But no definitive evidence linked him to the scene. Then Smith himself met a grisly end when his remote cabin went up in flames while police had it surrounded. With Smith presumed dead, the case went cold, forever haunting the region as the kind of ghost story locals told around the campfire. But then, the mountains kept their share of chilling secrets. Who was to say what other untold horrors they held in their ancient, forested heart? Ricky shook off the macabre train of thought. Those were the kinds of anxieties he came out here to escape. Still, he made a mental note not to let his guard down completely. A nourishing solitude could quickly veer into the unnerving isolation of a place so far removed. As hunger pangs grew sharper, Ricky decided to stop for lunch at the next shady glade along the creek. Even a handful of rehydrated bean mush would be a welcome break. He just had to have faith in the plenty of the forest, in the kindness of fellow hikers. The rhythms of trail life would provide. With Willie at his side, a well-provisioned pack on his back, and endless fresh country before him, Ricky felt uniquely blessed. Whatever unease lingered regarding the land's dark history, it was subsumed for now in the peace and wild beauty of the present moment. The trail always offered up its gifts to those who respected her. Chapter 2. Dwindling Supplies and Trail Traditions. By the time shadows began stretching long across the forest floor, Ricky's optimism about a fresh trout dinner had started to wane. He sat on a lichen-covered boulder, rod propped beside him, watching the golden light fade slowly from the burbling creek. In a pouch at his hip, all that remained were a couple of granola bars, a slim bag of trail mix, and a handful of beef jerky strips. He supposed it would hold him over for the evening, but the thought of actually sitting down to another Spartan meal made his stomach rumble plaintively. Not for the first time, Ricky wondered if he should have packed more substantial provisions. But part of the thrill of these solo excursions was putting his wilderness skills to the test, proving he could procure his own food straight from the source as his ancestors had done. Of course, those ancestors didn't have high-tech tents and water purification systems. Ricky chuckled wryly to himself, acknowledging the balance he tried to strike between modern comforts and rugged self-reliance. As he gazed at the flow of crystal-clear water over mossy rocks, Ricky thought about how much this creek had seen over the years, how many hands had cast lines into its pools, hoping to draw sustenance from its cold mountain depths. Those fishermen of old didn't have the advantage of scientifically engineered flies and collapsible graphite rods. But Ricky bet they knew the waterways like the backs of their work-worn hands, every riffle and eddy, each spot where the brookies gathered at dusk. Some of that deep, ancestral knowledge had been passed down to Ricky from his own father and grandfather. But there was still so much the land could teach those who took the time to watch and listen. The old-timers understood that, living by nature's rhythms out of necessity. Ricky felt humbled, honored even, to be engaging in the same rituals of the hunt as the Appalachian settlers who first carved out a rugged existence in these hills. In their days, bagging wild game could mean the difference between a full belly and a lean, hard winter. Yet there was a spiritual element to it as well that Ricky had always felt drawn to, a communion with the more-than-human world, the sense of fitting into one's ecological niche. Even if that role now included moisture-wicking synthetics and titanium cookware. Willie's soft whine at Ricky's knee brought him back to the present moment. He looked down to see the dog nudging a stick toward him with his graying muzzle, dark eyes pleading for a game of fetch. "Not now, bud," Ricky said with an indulgent pat to Willie's flank. "Still got some daylight to work with it." He picked up his rod once again, determined to give it a few more casts before the sun dipped below the ridgeline. Maybe he'd get lucky and happen upon a deep hole where the fish congregated. The promise of a fire-kissed meal kept him in his crouch, eyes scanning for any sign of tail flicks beneath the surface. As quiet settled over the hollow, Ricky couldn't help but miss the camaraderie of a hiking partner. Someone to swap stories with and commiserate over the one that got away. Sure, Willie was a fine companion, but his conversational skills left something to be desired. At times like this, Ricky felt the tug of trail magic, the tradition of small, serendipitous acts of generosity that knit together the loose community of Appalachian Trail through hikers. He had been the beneficiary of it himself over the years, from the hiker who shared her last pouch of dried fruit to the Boy Scout troop that appeared seemingly out of nowhere with an 18-pack of beer, just when the mosquitoes were at their worst. There was something special about the selfless camaraderie that formed so effortlessly out in these mountains. A recognition of shared struggle and purpose that brought out the best in folks from all walks of life. A willingness to lift up a weary traveler, knowing the favor would be repaid in kind down the line. So even as his own supplies ran thin, Ricky held on to that kernel of faith that the trail would provide in mysterious ways. He just had to keep showing up, putting one boot in front of the other, and one cast after another, trusting that the path held gifts for those with open hands and hearts. The shadows lengthened across the rippling water until only the highest ridgelines still glowed gold. With a sigh, Ricky collapsed his rod once more and whistled for Willie, who had been snuffling around the undergrowth at the creek's edge. As they followed the brook back in the direction of camp, Ricky surveyed their surroundings with newfound purpose. Perhaps a patch of chanterelle mushrooms peeking through the leaf litter or an old blackberry bramble would reveal itself. He had to start thinking like a forager, not just a fisherman, and trust the woods to be an eager collaborative partner. His mind drifted to stories he'd heard about lone hikers, malnourished and disoriented after weeks subsisting on little more than melted snow. How they'd finally dragged themselves to a Forest Service road or ranger station, hollowed out but still alive, thanks to their primal survival instinct and the largest of strangers. Ricky wasn't nearly that far gone, of course. But he understood now more viscerally how thin the line could be between a man and the howling rawness of nature in a place like this. how quickly a leisurely ramble could become a test of grit and resource. That heightened charge, that stripping away of all pretense, was part of what drew him out here. But Ricky also knew it was a double-edged sword. The same vast, impersonal forces that could cradle you in transcendence one moment might rise up to smite you the next. Still, he couldn't imagine being anywhere else, doing anything else to feed his soul the way a few days roaming these ancient hills did. Whatever came, Ricky would meet it with curiosity, readiness, and respect. The trail was a stern mistress, but a wise teacher. He just had to stay alert to her lessons. Chapter 3: A Dark Past. Later that night, with Willie curled at his side lending warmth, Ricky stared contemplatively into his small campfire. Flames crackled as they licked the dry hardwood gathered from the forest floor. It wasn't much, but enough to heat up some rehydrated bean stew and boil water for a mug of instant coffee, black as pitch. He couldn't shake the unsettled feeling that had crept in with the shadows, goosebumps raising on his arms that had little to do with the evening chill. Maybe it was his mind playing tricks after hours in solitude, or the story about the murders that kept flashing in his imagination. But Ricky swore the woods held a different quality after dark, expectant, watchful, full of hidden things. The scuff of a footfall, just a squirrel rooting for acorns. The hoot of an owl, not a phantom wail. Tricks of the firelight, not movements glimpsed from the corner of an eye. Ricky told himself these things, but still found his heart beating quicker, skin prickling with hypervigilance. Not for the first time, he questioned the wisdom of venturing out here alone. Ricky had made a point to tell family and friends his planned itinerary and had a GPS tracker beacon in case of emergency. But if something happened on a moonless night like this, miles from the nearest road or ranger station, would anyone know where to begin searching? It was a risk he had weighed and accepted each time he drove out to a remote trailhead like this one. An experienced outdoorsman, Ricky trusted his skills and preparation to keep him safe. It brought a heady sense of freedom and competence to be so self-reliant. But he also knew even the most seasoned hikers were at the mercy of luck and the elements in a place this isolated. Twisted ankles, unexpected storms, hungry predators, falls from slick rocks, the threats were many and help was far. Every choice had to be made judiciously out here where a small mistake could quickly spiral. Not to mention the whole history of violence and hardship woven into the fabric of these mountains. Ricky had read plenty about the feuds and massacres, the deadly accidents, and unsolved disappearances that haunted the hollers. Just the conditions the Appalachian settlers endured were enough to daunt the toughest soul. In particular, his mind wandered back to that brutal double homicide from decades past. How many times over the centuries had these hills borne witness to such primal human darkness, fear, desperation, bloodlust? There was a wildness in men that found deadly outlet far from the constraints of civilization. Though the killer in that infamous case was long dead, Ricky couldn't help but shiver at the thought that whoever had perpetrated those ritualistic murders had likely stalked the very paths he now walked, had filtered water from the same rushing streams, and made camp under the same dense stands of hemlock. What had made a man like that snap, Ricky wondered. What shadows had inhabited Randall Lee Smith's mind as he traversed this unforgiving backcountry, perhaps much like Ricky himself, solitary and immersed? Had the isolation warped him slowly, or had Smith carried those violent compulsions into the wilderness with him? Of course, Ricky knew to be wary of strangers out here, even as he believed most people to be kind and decent at heart. The unwritten code of camaraderie among hikers only went so far. You never knew what baggage someone might be toting that didn't show itself right away. He thought guiltily of the bare mace and hunting knife tucked deep in his pack. Ricky abhorred the thought of using them on anything other than a furry predator, but he wasn't naive. If it ever came down to him or some crazed drifter spoiling for trouble, he knew which he'd choose. With a shudder, Ricky pushed the dark thoughts away. He was letting his imagination and hunger get the better of him. The vast majority of folks drawn to a place like this were searching for the same things he was: peace, simplicity, a reconnection to something primal and good. They shared a desire to test themselves against an indifferent wild and come out the other side changed. No, he would not let the weight of a distant tragedy crush his appreciation for the stark, consoling beauty of these mountains. Evil may have touched them once, but it did not define them any more than a lighting scar defined a towering oak. The land endured, absorbing all. Ricky added another log to the fire, sending up a swirl of embers into the star-smattered sky. Willie huffed in his sleep, paws twitching as he chased dream rabbits. Ricky smiled fondly at his old friend. Together, they'd weathered plenty of dicey moments, always emerging on the other side with their bond stronger than ever. He laid another protective hand on Willie's flank, silently vowing not to let his spiraling thoughts taint this pocket of tranquility they'd carved out. The night was still theirs to savor, the wood smoke curling, the hoot of the vigilant owls, the silver dance of moonlight on the chattering creek. Whatever the morning brought, be it a twist of good fortune or another curveball to overcome, they'd face it when it came. For now, Ricky let his eyes slide shut, lulled by the pop and hiss of the campfire. In this circle of flickering light, at least, no shadows could penetrate. His dreams, when they came, were blessedly mundane, the darting fish slipping through dappled pools, distant laughter on the wind of passing hikers, the deep and blissful rest of the trail weary. If ghosts walked the night forest beyond, they did not trouble Ricky's sleep. It was Willie who woke him shortly after dawn, cold nose shoved demandingly in his master's face. Ricky blinked groggily, momentarily confused by the thin gray light sifting through the tent fabric. Then the previous day's exertions and continued lack of fish came rushing back. "Okay, I'm up," he mock grumbled, unzipping the tent flap to greet a crisp, dewy morning. Willie danced with anticipation, ready for another day of adventure. Ricky stretched the kinks from his joints, thankful as ever for his warm, dry sleeping bag. As he emerged into the dawn hush, Ricky took a long moment to appreciate the simple perfection of his surroundings once more, the whisper of birdsong, the clean scent of pine and petrichor. It was almost enough to make him forget the unease of the long night. Almost, but not quite. As he efficiently broke camp and shouldered his pack with a sigh, Ricky couldn't fully dismiss the weight of foreboding that had settled in his gut. He told himself it was just low blood sugar talking, remnants of fireside ghost stories preying on his mind. But something felt different this morning, a charge to the air, an unnatural stillness. Ricky shook it off as best he could. The trail always had new wonders and challenges to offer. He'd focus on those, not the phantoms of a distant past. With Willie leading the way, nose to the wind, they set off once more along the burbling creek, senses alert and attuned. Little did Ricky know that his fate and the shadow history of this place were about to entwine in ways he couldn't possibly anticipate. As he moved deeper into the storied forest, a chain of events was already unspooling that would test him in ways even the most intrepid outdoorsman could never prepare for. For now, at least, the morning sun climbed the canopy, bathing the trail in gold. The fish still swam the rushing creek, hawks still wheeled overhead. A fine day for losing oneself once more in the stern, consoling while. With faith in the path and his own well-honed wits, Ricky strode on. Chapter 4. An Unexpected Encounter. The morning passed uneventfully as Ricky meandered along Dismal Creek, pausing occasionally to work a promising riffle or pool with his trusty rod. Though he managed to hook a few small native trout, none were of keeping size. He released each one with a pang of reluctance and a prayer of gratitude. Still, the meditative rhythm of the cast and drift was a balm to his unsettled spirit. Out here, with only the burble of the stream and birdsong for company, it was easier to shake off the ghosts of bygone tragedy, to inhabit the present moment fully once more. After a simple trailside lunch of jerky and wild raspberries foraged from a sun-drenched hillside, Ricky stumbled upon a particularly inviting stretch of water, a deep, shaded pool fed by a frothy chute. The crystal current practically shimmered with pissing promise. Willie, too, seemed to sense the rightness of this spot. As Ricky assembled his rod, the dog eagerly sniffed along the bank as if to flush out their elusive quarry. But just as Ricky was drawing back for his first cast, Willie suddenly froze, nose quivering, hackles rising in a silent growl. Ricky tensed, scanning the dense laurels for any sign of a black bear or bobcat. But before he could spot the source of Willie's unease, a voice rang out from just upstream around the bend. "Well, hello there. Didn't mean to startle you." A wiry man with a salt and pepper beard emerged from the thicket, fly rod in hand, an easy grin splitting his tanned face. He looked to be about Ricky's age, but even leaner, with the sinewy build of a lifelong outdoorsman. Willie relaxed fractionally at the unthreatening figure, but still remained alert at Ricky's heel, when I trained warily on the stranger. "Howdy," Ricky called back cautiously, hand drifting to the bare mace at his belt out of sheer reflex. "I'm Ricky, this here's Willie." "Scott Johansson," the man replied, holding up a palm and a gesture of goodwill. "Sorry if I snuck up on you. I've been working my way downstream all morning. The fishing's been mighty slow." Ricky felt some of his initial wariness drain away at the man's affable manner. Out here especially, it paid to trust your gut about people, and something about Scott's open, weathered face inspired an instinctive confidence. "You're telling me," Ricky said wryly, nodding to his empty creel. "I was hoping this honey hole might finally produce, but no bites so far." Scott chuckled, tugging at his beard. "A couple beautiful native brookies, though. Some days that's the best you can ask for." Ricky found himself grinning back despite himself. It felt good to share the joys and frustrations of the sport with a kindred spirit. "Amen, brother," Scott said. He leaned on his rod, keen eyes sweeping their lush surroundings. God sure knew what he was doing when he made these mountains, didn't he? Ricky nodded, following his gaze to the emerald hills soaring on all sides. "Puts everything in perspective, that's for sure." Scott hummed in agreement. "There's something about the backcountry that just strips it all away. The deadlines, the bills, all that noise out here, it's just you and the Almighty. And the occasional cooperative trout, if you're lucky," Ricky added. They shared a knowing chuckle at that. It was amazing, Ricky mused, how the unwritten code of the trail could turn strangers into easy confidants within minutes. There was a shorthand among those who chose to seek out these wild places, an unspoken understanding born of shared passions and hardships. Willie, too, seemed to have warmed to Scott, stepping forward to accept an ear scratch and a soft word of endearment. Ricky felt the last of his defenses lowering at the sight. You could tell a lot about a man by how he treated animals. Say, Scott said after a contemplative beat, I don't suppose you'd like some company for the day? Seems like the fish might be more willing with 2 lines in the water. I've got a nice campfire gourmet feast planned for the evening if we manage to land a few. Ricky hesitated only a moment. The whole point of this trip had been solitude and self-reliance. But after the eerie isolation of the past few days, the prospect of splitting a meal and swapping stories around a fire held sudden appeal. I'd like that, he said sincerely. I've got fixings for some killer campfire potatoes if you're interested. Oh, you had me at killer. Scott's eyes twinkled with mirth and anticipation. I even packed in a flask of sipping whiskey for just such an occasion. Ricky laughed, marveling at the serendipity of the moment, how a chance encounter could alter the whole tenor of the day. Well then, I'd say we've got our work cut out for us. With the easy rhythm of long practice, the 2 men spread out along the pool, trading quips and observations as they settled into the timeless dance of cast and drift. Even Willie seemed to pick up on the lighter mood, tail wagging with each shimmering loop of line across the water. Fish or no fish, Ricky realized, it was shaping up to be one of those golden, ineffable days he'd carry with him long after the trip ended. A memory to return to when the clamor of the world pressed too close. A reminder of nature's knack for bringing like souls together in mysterious ways. Of course, he couldn't know then how that very solidarity, that very instinct to find kinship in the wild, was about to lead him down a far darker path than he ever could have imagined. Even as he and Scott traded grins over a particularly feisty rainbow trout, fate was conspiring to test the limits of trust and camaraderie. But that reckoning still lay ahead, shrouded for now in the innocent joy of hard-won catches and the warm snap of a campfire. As the afternoon shadows lengthened over Dismal Creek, Ricky let himself savor the uncomplicated pleasure of new friendship, the promise of laughter and tales shared under the vault of stars. There would be time enough for wariness later, for questioning all he thought he knew about the shape's danger and darkness could take. For the moment at least, he'd revel in this brief resurgence of all that was good and right with the world, the brotherhood of rod and stream, of 2 pilgrims chasing down the Appalachian Trail's most cherished magic. As he released another glittering trout back into the brisk current, Ricky sent up a silent prayer of gratitude to the waters for delivering him from solitude, however fleeting the reprieve might prove to be. Chapter 5. Bonding over fishing. The afternoon unspooled lazily along Dismal Creek as Ricky and Scott gave themselves over fully to the ancient rhythms of fly fishing. They waded thigh-deep in the swift current, trading techniques and bad jokes, Willie splashing gamely between them. It was the kind of easy camaraderie Ricky usually only found with friends he'd known for years. That's some artful mending right there, Scott called admiringly, as Ricky executed a particularly skillful drift along a foamy run. You fish like a man possessed. Ricky grinned, feeling a flush of pride at the compliment. I learned from the best. My granddad had me with a rod in my hand soon as I could toddle. Sounds like my kind of fella, Scott said, eyes crinkling fondly. A day on the water beats a day anywhere else. That's what Pa always told me. Amen, Ricky said, marveling at the similar shape of their origin stories, the way a love of wild streams seemed to pass like a torch down the generations. As the shadows lengthened and their catches accumulated, the men took a break on the sun-warmed bank, shoulder to shoulder with contentment. Willie flopped at their feet, tongue-lolling blissfully. Ricky looked down at his brimming creel with bone-deep satisfaction, several fine specimens destined for the frying pan. Nothing tastes so sweet as when you've worked for it, he said, running an appreciative hand over the gleaming scales. Scott hummed his agreement, and earned it as cleanly as the good Lord intended. They sat in companionable silence for a spell, listening to the timeless music of flow and birdsong. Ricky marveled at how attuned Scott seemed to be to the subtlest workings of the watershed, the specific insect hatches, the likely lairs of the big, wily browns. He clearly knew this stretch of creek like the back of his weathered hand. "Must have spent a lot of time up in these hills, I take it?" Ricky ventured, suddenly curious to learn more about his newfound friend. Scott leaned back on his elbows with a wistful sigh. "Been rambling around these hollers since I was knee-high to a grasshopper. Folks always said I had an itchy foot. Never could stay put in one spot too long before the woods started calling my name." "I can relate," Ricky said with a chuckle. "My ex-wife used to say my only true mistress was the Appalachian Trail." Scott nodded sagely. "It's a harsh taskmaster, but a soul-feeding one." He swept an arm to encompass the emerald valley unfurled around them, the late golden light washing the ridgelines. "Hard to worry about the state of your 400 wonk with all this splendor to drink in." "Roger that." Ricky breathed deeply of the hemlock-scented air, letting his everyday stresses dissolve like morning mist from the stream. "I don't know how folks can stand being cooped up in a cubicle all day when there's so much aliveness out here just waiting for you." "It's a different kind of work for a different kind of reward," Scott said, squinting into the warm rays. "Some might say we're chasing fool's gold, hunting down trout and sunsets instead of stock options, but I've never once regretted my choice." "Nor have I," Ricky said feelingly. "However long I get to walk this green earth, I plan to do it with a fly rod in my hand until the very end." "I'll cling to that." Scott mimed raising a glass, eyes twinkling. "A toast to living deliberately and sucking all the marrow out of life, Mr. Thoreau would say." Ricky huffed a laugh, warmed by both the sentiment and the erudite reference. He hadn't taken Scott for a literary type, but he kept being pleasantly surprised by the depth behind the man's thoughtful gaze. They lapsed back into easy silence, letting the peace of the moment wash over them like a baptism. Ricky found himself losing track of time, lulled by the creek's lullaby, immersed fully in the here and now. He surfaced only when Scott stretched with a groan, nodding to the expanse of deep blue sky, now salted with the first brave stars. "Guess we better go see about that camp dinner while we still have light to cook by, eh?" Willie's ears perked up at the word dinner, drawing fond chuckles from both men. "I believe that's our cue," Ricky said, gathering up his gear with a pang of wistfulness. He was loath to break the idyllic spell that seemed to hover over this stretch of stream. Scott hauled himself up as well, clapping Ricky on the shoulder. "Come on then, compadre, if we play our cards right, we'll be toasting our adventures under a blanket of stars before you know it. I've got a feeling this is going to be a meal for the memory books." Ricky grinned back, already salivating at the thought of crispy trout fillets seasoned with forage wild ramps. "Well, we better get a move on then. Lead the way, oh captain, my captain." As they ambled downstream in the blue gloaming, trading fish tales and trail lore, Ricky marveled once again at the trail's mysterious alchemy, the way hardship and isolation could give way so suddenly to soul-feeding connection when you least expected it. He still didn't know much about Scott beyond their shared love of rod and stream, the contours of a life lived deliberately in the wild. But his gut told him their crossing of paths was no mere accident of timing. There was a reason this enigmatic wanderer had materialized when he did, an unspoken rightness to their easy rapport. Whether that kinship lasted for a single night of campfire carousing or the duration of his trip mattered little in the grand scheme of things. What counted was the gift of the present moment, the renewed awareness that even in the depths of solitude, The universe could surprise you with a sudden flash of belonging. And so Ricky followed Scott's confident stride into the gathering dark, buoyed by that flicker of human warmth even as the ancient woods closed in around them. The ghosts in his head seemed to recede with each step, chased off by the prospect of good food and better company. Little could he imagine, adrift in trail-weary gratitude as he was, that his fortuitous encounter with a kindred spirit was about to take a far more sinister turn. That the fishtails and ramp-studded freshwater delicacies would soon be tainted by an evil as old and insidious as the hills themselves. He walked on into the twilight, blissfully unaware that his long-sought communion with the wild was about to come at a cost far steeper than he'd ever dreamed of paying, and that the man striding so jauntily ahead might just be the one to extract the price in blood and betrayal. Chapter 6. An Invitation. The sun hung low on the horizon, painting the ridgelines in shades of flame and shadow by the time Ricky and Scott arrived at the latter's makeshift camp. It was a tidy, minimal affair, just a weathered tent pitched beneath a gnarled oak, ringed by a humble fire ring. But to Ricky's weary feet and grumbling stomach, it promised all the comforts of a backcountry feast. As they unpacked their rucksacks and took inventory of their combined provisions, the men fell into an easy rhythm, trading tasks with the fluidity of a long-established team. Ricky took on dressing the trout, while Scott foraged for wild greens and mushrooms to fill out their meal. Willie patrolled the perimeter, nose to the wind, ever the dutiful watchdog. The air filled with the tantalizing scent of sizzling fish and the warm snap of a healthy blaze as they got down to the pleasurable work of preparing dinner. Ricky found himself humming tunelessly, utterly absorbed in the tactile joys of transforming their hard-won catch into a rustic gourmet spread. "You want to do the honors with the ramps?" he asked after a time, gesturing to the pungent, wild leeks he'd chopped with his pocket knife. "I've never been much for seasoning beyond salt and pepper." "Glad to," Scott said, accepting a slab of butter to saute the alliums. "Though I gotta say, looks like you've got a downright reverent touch with a fillet knife. Those trout could grace the cover field and stream." Ricky docked his head, warmed by the praise and the glow of the fire on his face. "Just something my granddad taught me. Respect the fish by treating them right, snout to tail." Scott nodded, eyes gleaming with approval. "Amen. It's a covenant, fishing. You take only what you need, use every part, give thanks for the gift." "Wish more folks saw it that way," Ricky mused as he turned the fillets with a deft flick of his wrist. "So much ugly greed and waste in this world." Now, let's not dwell on all that," Scott chided gently. "Not when we've got this little slice of heaven laid out before us." He nodded to their makeshift feast, the golden crisp trout stippled with herbs, the buttery chanterelles nestled in a bed of ramp greens, a crusty heel of campfire toasted bread. It was a meal fit for kings, wrought from the honest work of rod and stream. "I suppose you're right," Ricky conceded with a rueful grin. "Gotta savor the good where we can find it." They tucked in then with gusto, wielding forks and fingers, trading appreciative grunts. To Ricky's trail-starved palate, each mouthful burst with wild vitality, the sweet brine of the trout tempered by the garlicky kick of ramps, the loamy depth of the foraged mushrooms grounded by the smoky char of bread. He closed his eyes in rhapsody, marveling at the alchemy of it all, and how the meanest morsels could be rendered sublime by a bit of woodcraft and the company of a fellow pilgrim. It felt like partaking of a timeless sacrament, one that bound him to generations of sojourners who had likewise found sustenance in the backcountry. They ate slowly, reverently, punctuating the meal with sips of Scott's promised whiskey and contented sighs. Even Willie benefited from their largesse, wolfing down the odd scrap tossed his way with unabashed delight. When at last their bellies were full and the fire had burned to embers, Ricky leaned back on his elbows with a groan of pure animal satisfaction. He couldn't remember the last time he'd felt so deeply nourished in body, mind, and spirit. "I gotta hand it to you, Scotta. That was one for the ages," he said, nodding to the soot-stained skillet lick clean between them. "If that's eating deliberately, then call me a bona fide Tarovi." Scott raised his flask in a mock toast, firelight dancing in his eyes. "To sucking the marrow, then, and to the trails that lead us to kindred souls." They clinked tin on tin, the sharp report echoing through the pines like punctuation. Ricky took a bracing swallow, savoring the sweet burn of corn whiskey and camaraderie on his tongue. "You know," Scott said after a meditative silence, "a man could get used to this." "What's that?" Ricky cocked an eyebrow, already sensing where this was heading but playing coy. "Having someone to share a meal and a fire with at the end of a long day on the water." Scott's gaze was steady, appraising. "Someone who gets it, you know, the call of the wild." Ricky felt an unexpected flutter of warmth in his chest, like the first lick of flame to tinder. It had been a long time since anyone had looked at him with such frank, unself-conscious kinship. "I hear you," he said, surprised by the gruffness in his own voice. "It's a rare gift, finding your tribe out here." "Especially in this day and age," Scott said with a rueful headshake. Folks too glued to their screens to even notice the everyday miracles unfurling around them. "Their loss," Ricky said, punctuating it with a slug of whiskey. "Damn straight." Scott's grin flashed fierce in the firelight. He seemed to come to some private decision then, setting his flask aside with an air of resolve. "Say, Ricky," he began, choosing his words with care. "I know we just met and all, but I feel like the trail brought you to my doorstep for a reason. Like maybe we were meant to ramble together a while longer." Ricky blinked, taken aback by the earnestness of the overture. "How do you mean?" Scott leaned forward, elbows on knees, the very picture of sincerity. "I mean, what would you say to joining up with me for the rest of your trip, combining camps, pooling resources, seeing what other adventures we can cook up?" Ricky hesitated, torn between the knee-jerk wariness of a solo sojourner and the undeniable pull of Scott's open, guileless offer. It was a lot to take in, this sudden swerve from chance encounter to sworn trailmates. "I don't know," he hedged, glancing way into the night-shrouded woods. "I'm mighty fond of my own company out here." "And I respect the hell out of that," Scott rushed to assure him. "Believe me, I'm no stranger to the pleasures of solitude. But sometimes the trail has a way of bringing folks together for a reason, you know. It wants to teach us something about our shared humanity." Ricky looked back at him, searching for any hint of ulterior motive in those flinty blue eyes. But all he saw was a mirror of his own soul-deep longing for connection, for a witness to the wonders and hardships of the wild. "I suppose I can't argue with that," he said slowly, testing the shape of the words in his mouth. "The trail does work in mysterious ways." Scott's grin widened, sensing an opening. "So what do you say, compatter? Ready to see where this partnership leads us?" Ricky took a final, fortifying swig of whiskey, feeling the burn of it bolster his courage. There was a rightness to the proposition, he had to admit, a sense of paths converging that he couldn't quite shake. "Ah, hell," he said finally, meeting Scott's gaze square-on. "I'm game if you are." Scott let out a whoop of delight, startling Willie from his fireside doze. "Now that's what I like to hear, the dynamic fishing duo, ready to take on whatever the backcountry throws our way." They shook on it, hands clasped tight across the flickering flames, sealing the pact with all the solemnity of a blood oath. Ricky felt a thrill of anticipation shiver up his spine, chased by an unnameable flicker of foreboding. But he pushed the latter aside, determined to embrace the gift the trail had seen fit to grant him. If the past few years had taught him anything, it was to seize joy and camaraderie wherever they presented themselves, to trust in the journey even when the path ahead lay shrouded in shadow. "To new beginnings, then," he said, raising his flask one last time. "And to seeing where the current takes us." "I'll cling to that," Scott said feelingly. "To the brotherhood of stream and trail." They drank, trading grins over the dying embers like conspirators in some grand cosmic scheme. And for a fleeting moment, Ricky could almost believe that all was right in his world, that he had found in Scott the missing piece to some long-held hunger. Little could he imagine, flush with fireside fellowship as he was, the dark turns their budding partnership was about to take. That the man who had appeared as a friend might soon be revealed as something far more sinister, a twisted reflection of his own deepest fears and desires. For now, at least, he would savor the warm wash of kinship, the promise of trails yet to be blazed in good company. The shadows could wait to be reckoned with come dawn. Tonight belonged to the simple magic of two pilgrims finding grace in the wild, however fleeting it might prove to be. Chapter 7. A Tangled Path. The next morning dawned crisp and clear, the air thrumming with the manic industry of a billion unseen creatures. Ricky surfaced slowly from the depths of a whiskey-scented slumber, momentarily disoriented by the absence of his own tense, familiar contours. Then the events of the previous day came rushing back in a heady torrent. The golden afternoon fishing with Scott, the riverside feast of trout and ramps, the fateful decision to join forces for the remainder of his trip. He sat up gingerly, head muzzy with the lingering effects of too much campfire conviviality. Scott was already up and about, whistling tunelessly as he puttered around the clearing. He had a small fire going, and the battered coffee percolator burbling away atop it. "Mornin', sunshine," he called when he caught sight of Ricky emerging from the tent, rumpled and bleary-eyed. "I was just about to come roust you. The trout are calling our names." Ricky groaned, fumbling for his water bottle. "I think they're gonna have to wait a spell. My head's pounding like a drum circle at a payout ritual." Scott barked a laugh, far too chipper for the early hour. "Nothing a little cowboy coffee and a bracing dip in the creek won't cure, trust me. I've fished through far worse." Ricky just grunted, unsure whether to be impressed or appalled by his new partner's constitution. He accepted a tin mug of the proffered brew, with a nod of thanks, wrapping his hands around its comforting warmth. The first sip scalded his tongue, but he hardly noticed, too focused on the blessed jolt of caffeine to his sluggish system. Maybe Scott was onto something with this hair of the dog approach. They broke their fast on a simple meal of oatmeal studded with wild berries, trading idle speculation about which sections of the creek might prove most productive. Ricky found himself slipping easily back into the rapport they'd established the day before, the conversation flowing as naturally as the water over stones. It felt good, he had to admit, having someone to bounce ideas off of, to share in the giddy anticipation of a day on the water. He'd almost forgotten the bone-deep pleasure of building a partnership from the ground up, of learning to anticipate another's rhythms and needs. And Scott, for all his enigmatic intensity, was proving to be a considerate and thoughtful companion. He deferred to Ricky's expertise when it came to reading the rapids, trusting his judgment on the likeliest layers of the big, wary browns. and he had a knack for keeping spirits up with his ready supply of off-colored jokes and philosophical musings. By the time they'd packed up camp and struck out for the first promising bend, Ricky was feeling downright optimistic about their chances. The sun was just starting to burn through the morning mist, gilding the hills in a soft, buttery light that fairly begged to be immortalized on canvas. They hiked in companionable silence for a while, the only sounds the crunch of their boots on the trail and the muffled pat of Willie's paws. The old dog seemed to have taken a shine to Scott, trotting contentedly at his heels and angling for the occasional ear scratch. It warmed Ricky to see it, this easy affection between his two trail companions. He'd always believed that animals were the best judges of character, attuned to subtleties of intent that often escape the human eye. If Willie trusted Scott, then Ricky figured he was on pretty solid ground doing the same. As they rounded a bend in the path, Scott suddenly pulled up short, face scrunched in consternation. "Well, damn," he muttered, fiddling with his rod. "Looks like I've gone and snagged my line on something fierce." Ricky craned his neck to see, taking in the hopeless tangle of monofilament wrapped around a low-hanging branch. It was the kind of stubborn snarl that could eat up half the morning to unravel, even with the deftest of fingers. "You want a hand with that?" he asked, already reaching for his clippers. But Scott waved him off, a rueful grin tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Nah, you go on ahead. No sense both of us wasting prime fishing hours on account of my butterfingers." Ricky hesitated, loath to leave his friend in the lurch. "You sure? I don't mind waiting." "Positive." Scott shooed him onward with a flap of his hand. "Camp's just a few minutes hike that away, hard by that big old boulder that looks like a grizzly taking a snooze. You and Willie get a fire going, and I'll be along directly." Ricky wavered a moment longer, torn between the itch to wet a line and the nagging sense that he shouldn't abandon his partner, however briefly. But Scott seemed adamant, already turning his attention to the finicky, not with a look of mulish determination. "All right then," Ricky said finally, hitching his pack higher on his shoulders. "But holler if you need anything you hear. I'll come back to check on you in 2 shakes." "Roger that." Scott sketched a mock salute, eyes glinting with mischief. "I'll do it before I change my mind and make you untangle this bird's nest yourself." Ricky huffed a laugh, shaking his head at the man's irrepressible humor. "See on then, Willie," he said, patting his thigh for the dog to follow. "Let's go see about this fancy new campsite of ours." They set off down the trail at a brisk clip, Ricky's ears straining for any sound of distress from behind. But the woods were preternaturally still, the only noise the muted gurgle of the unseen creek somewhere to their left. Before long, the path opened up into a small, shaded glen, dominated by a hulking outcropping of granite that did indeed resemble a slumbering bear. Beneath it, just visible through a screen of hemlock boughs, was a flash of weathered canvas that could only be Scott's tent. Ricky felt a flicker of relief at having reached their destination without incident. But as he drew closer, that relief quickly curdled into a wary unease. For there, scattered around the fire pit like the leavings of some backcountry revel, was an assortment of gear that clearly did not belong to Scott. A battered rucksack, patched and grimy with hard use. A pair of mud-caked boots, soles worn smooth as river stones. And most unsettling of all, a long-bladed hunting knife thrust carelessly into the loam as if discarded in haste. Ricky froze at the edge of the clearing, heart suddenly hammering against his ribs. He swept his gaze around the glen, searching for any sign of the interloper, but the space appeared deserted save for himself and Willie. The dog, too, had gone rigid at his side, hackles rising along his spine, as he stared fixedly at the strange tent. A low, rumbling growl bubbled up from his chest, setting Ricky's nerves jangling like live wires. He knew he should turn tail and run, hike be damned. Should hightail it back to the main trail and the relative safety of other hikers. Whatever was going on here, it smacked of the kind of trouble he'd come to the woods to avoid, not court. But some perverse instinct kept him rooted to the spot, even as every fiber of his being screamed at him to flee. Maybe it was the thought of abandoning Scott to an unknown fate, or the stubborn pride that balked at running from a challenge. Or maybe it was something darker, a morbid fascination with the shadows that lurked at the edges of the backcountry idol. Whatever the reason, Ricky found himself taking a tentative step forward, hand drifting unconsciously to the hilt of his own knife. He cleared his throat, wincing at how loud it sounded in the eerie hush of the glen. "Hello," he called out, hating the tremor in his voice. "Anybody there?" For a long, tense moment, there was no reply. Then, just as he was about to call out again, the flap of the strange tent twitched aside, and a figure emerged into the dappled light. It was a man. That much was immediately apparent. But beyond that basic fact, Ricky's mind struggled to make sense of what he was seeing. The stranger was tall and heavily muscled, with a shaved head that gleamed like polished bone in the sun. He wore a threadbare flannel shirt with the sleeves ripped off, revealing arms thick with crude jailhouse tattoos. And his face, dear God, his face. It was a ruin of scar tissue and malice, lips curled back from nicotine-stained teeth in a feral sneer. "Who the fuck are you?" the man growled, taking a menacing step forward. Ricky fought the urge to backpedal, forcing himself to stand his ground. "I'm Ricky. I'm camping with Scott just up the trail. Is this your site?" The man's eyes narrowed, flicking from Ricky to Willie and back again. "Might be. What's it to you?" Ricky swallowed hard, mouth suddenly bone dry. "I think there's been some kind of misunderstanding. Scott said this was his spot." "Did he now?" The man's sneer widened, turning uglier. "Well, ain't that just like old Scotty? Always thinking he can just take what he wants." There was a dark history there, Ricky could tell. A bitterness that went far beyond a simple territorial dispute. He felt a chill run down his spine, wondering just what kind of hornet's nest he'd stumbled into. "Look, we don't want any trouble," he said carefully, spreading his hands in a placating gesture. "We can just pack up and clear out, find another spot." The man barked a harsh, humorless laugh. "Oh, it's way too late for that. Friends, see me and Scotty? We got some unfinished business to tend to, and it looks like you just bought yourself a front row seat to the reckoning." Ricky's heart dropped into his stomach, a sick dread knotting his guts. He could see it in the man's dead, shark-like eyes, the hunger for violence, the twisted glee at having found fresh prey to torment. This was no ordinary trail dispute, no mere clash of alpha males jockeying for dominance. This was something much, much worse, a dark and festering hatred that had been waiting for just such a moment to boil over. He thought of Scott, blithely untangling his line just a few hundred yards away, oblivious to the danger that lurked in his own backyard. Of Willie, loyal and trusting to a fault, ready to leap into the fray at a moment's notice. And he thought of himself, the foolish old man who'd let his guard down, let himself be lulled by a pretty stretch of water and a kind word, who'd walked them all straight into the lion's den without a second thought. In that moment, Ricky knew with a bone-deep certainty that he'd made a grave mistake. That the camaraderie of the past day had been nothing more than a cruel illusion, a bit of trail magic conjured up to lure him to his doom. And now it was too late to run, too late to do anything but stand his ground and pray that he had the strength to see this through. To protect the ones he'd unwittingly put in harm's way, even if it meant laying down his own life in the process. He squared his shoulders, meeting the stranger's gaze with a calm he did not feel. "I don't know what kind of history you two have," he said evenly. "But I'm asking you man, to let it go. Just for today, just walk away and let us be on our way." The man's lips peeled back in a death's head grin, a chilling rictus of malevolence. "Oh, I'll let you be on your way, all right," he said softly. "Straight to hell, along with that two-faced son of a bitch you call a friend." And with that, he lunged forward, hands outstretched like claws, murder in his eyes. Ricky had just enough time to shove Willie behind him before the impact came, sending them both tumbling to the blood-soaked earth in a tangle of limbs and snarling fury. As he grappled with the madman, feeling the bite of nails in his flesh and the hot stink of rage in his face, Ricky could only marvel at the cruel caprice of fate. At the way a perfect golden day could turn on a dime, plunging a man into a waking nightmare without warning or reason. He thought fleetingly of his own dark history, the shadows he'd fled to these hills to escape. The ghosts that dogged his every step, no matter how far or fast he ran. And he wondered, in a moment of grim epiphany, if this was the trail's way of calling in its debts, of reminding him that the wild was not a place of healing, but of reckoning, a crucible that stripped a man down to his barest essence, for good or ill. As the blows rained down and the world began to fade into a red mist of pain, Ricky could only pray that Scott would find them in time. That Willie would have the sense to run, to save himself from the horror that had come to claim them all. And then there was only darkness, and the sound of screaming, and a sickening crunch of bone giving way beneath a madman's fists. The last thing Ricky saw before the void took him was the stranger's face, leering down at him like a gargoyle, lips pulled back in a rictus of triumph. And then he knew no more, lost in a black swirl of blood and betrayal, with only the fading memory of a perfect day on the water to light his way into oblivion. Chapter 8. A Startling Departure. Ricky came awake with a strangled gasp, clawing his way up from the depths of a nightmare that clung to him like tar. For a long, disoriented moment, he couldn't figure out where he was or how he'd gotten there. Everything was a jumble of pain and confusion, a red haze of fractured memories that made no sense. Then it all came rushing back in a sickening flood. The stranger in the clearing, the vicious ambush, the feeling of fists slamming into his flesh with ruthless abandon. He jackknifed upright, ignoring the white-hot flare of agony in his ribs, eyes wild and searching. He was still in the glen, that much was immediately apparent. The slumbering bear of a boulder loomed over him like a sentinel, unmoved by the carnage that had unfolded at its base. The strange tent and gear were gone, as if they'd never been there at all. And Willie, dear God, where was Willie? Ricky's heart seized in his chest, a cold sweat breaking out on his brow. The last thing he remembered was shoving the dog behind him, trying to shield him from the worst of the onslaught. But everything after that was a blur, lost in the red mist of rage and terror. He staggered to his feet, swaying like a drunk as the world tilted dangerously around him. His head felt like it was stuffed with cotton, his thoughts sluggish and disjointed. But one imperative burned through the fog like a beacon: you find Willie, find Scott, get the hell out of this nightmare before it was too late. He lurched forward, stumbling over roots and rocks as he tried to orient himself. The sun was low in the sky, painting the trees in shades of blood and shadow. How long had he been out? Minutes, hours? It felt like an eternity, a lifetime of pain and betrayal compressed into a single, endless moment. As he neared the edge of the clearing, a sound caught his attention, a low, mournful whine that made his heart clench in his chest. He whirled around, hope warring with dread, as he scanned the underbrush for the source. And there, huddled beneath a dense thicket of laurel, was Willie. The dog was trembling violently, his muzzle streaked with dirt and blood. But he was alive, and in that moment, that was all that mattered. "Willie," Ricky croaked, dropping to his knees and holding out a shaking hand. "See mere boy, it's okay, I got you." The dog hesitated for a moment, ears flattened against his skull. Then, with a whimper of relief, he crawled out from his hiding spot and buried his face in Ricky's chest, tail thumping weakly. Ricky wrapped his arms around him, burying his face in the soft, familiar fur. He could feel the dog's heart hammering against his own, a frantic tattoo of fear and exhaustion. But beneath that, there was something else, a fierce, unyielding love that made Ricky's throat tighten with emotion. "You did good, buddy," he murmured, scratching behind Willie's ears with a trembling hand. "You did real good. I'm so sorry I put you through that." Willie just whined softly, pressing closer as if trying to crawl inside Ricky's skin. And in that moment, Ricky knew that he would do anything at all, to keep this loyal, trusting creature safe. Even if it meant facing down a monster in human form, even if it meant laying down his own life in the process. But first, he had to find Scott. Had to warn him about the danger that lurked in these hills, the dark history that had come back to claim them all. He didn't know what kind of twisted vendetta the stranger had against his friend, but he knew that it wasn't over. Not by a long shot. With a groan of effort, Ricky hauled himself to his feet once more, swaying slightly as the world tilted around him. His head was pounding like a jackhammer, his vision blurring at the edges. But he gritted his teeth and forced himself to take a step, then another. Willie pressed close to his side. They had to get back to the main trail, had to find help before it was too late. Before the madman returned to finish what he'd started, before Scott walked blindly into an ambush of his own making. Ricky didn't know what he'd do when he found his friend, what he'd say to explain the horror that had unfolded in his absence. But he knew that he had to try, had to do whatever it took to keep them both alive. Even if it meant facing down his own demons. Even if it meant confronting the shadows that had dogged his every step for longer than he cared to remember. As they stumbled out of the clearing and onto the narrow, winding trail, Ricky felt a chill run down his spine. The woods that had seemed so inviting just a day before now felt sinister and threatening. Every shadow a lurking menace, every sound a harbinger of doom. And yet beneath that fear, there was something else. A grim determination, a stubborn refusal to let the darkness win. He had come to these hills seeking solace and renewal, a chance to escape the ghosts of his past and start anew. And he'd be damned if he'd let some twisted psychopath take that away from him, not without a fight. So he pushed on, one foot in front of the other, Willie at his side, and the taste of blood in his mouth. The sun was setting fast, the shadows lengthening with every passing moment. But Ricky didn't care. He had a mission now, a purpose that went beyond mere survival. He had to find Scott, had to warn him about the danger that lurked in these hills. And he had to do it before it was too late, before the stranger returned to finish what he'd started. Even if it meant putting himself in the crosshairs once more. Even if it meant facing down the darkness head-on. Because in the end, that was what the wild was all about, not just beauty and solace, but struggle and sacrifice. A place where a man could test his mettle against the elements, against his own demons and fears, and come out the other side stronger, more alive than he'd ever been before. As the last of the light faded from the sky and the stars began to wink to life overhead, Ricky felt a flicker of hope kindle in his chest. Maybe, just maybe, he could still salvage something from this nightmare. Maybe he could still find a way to make things right, to protect the ones he cared about and come out the other side unscathed. Or maybe he was just a foolish old man, stumbling blindly towards his own destruction. Either way, he had to try. For Willie's sake, for Scott's sake, for the sake of his own battered and bleeding soul. And so he pushed on, into the gathering dark, with only the sound of his own ragged breathing and the soft pat of Willie's paws to guide him. The stranger was out there somewhere, waiting for his chance to strike. But Ricky was ready for him now. Ready to face whatever horrors the night had in store, ready to fight like hell for the things that mattered most. Even if it killed him in the end, even if it meant sacrificing everything he held dear. Because sometimes that was the only way to find redemption. The only way to make things right in a world gone mad with violence and despair. As the last of the light faded from the sky and the first stars began to wink to life overhead, Ricky felt a flicker of hope kindle in his chest. Maybe, just maybe, he could still salvage something from this nightmare. Maybe he could still find a way to protect the ones he loved and come out the other side unscathed. Or maybe he was just a foolish old man, stumbling blindly towards his own destruction. Either way, he had to try. For Willie's sake, for Scott's sake, for the sake of his own battered and bleeding soul. And so he pushed on, into the gathering dark, with only the sound of his own ragged breathing and the soft pat of Willie's paws to guide him. The psycho who'd bushwhacked them was out there somewhere, waiting for his chance to strike again. But Ricky would be ready for him this time. Ready to go down swinging if that's what it took. Because in a place like this, that's all a man could do. Stand tall against the darkness, even when it felt like the whole world was conspiring to bring him to his knees. It was a hard truth, but the woods didn't trade in soft lies. Out here, the only way out was through. Through the fear and the pain, the blood and the madness. Through the valley of the shadow, to whatever waited on the other side. Ricky didn't know what that would be. Redemption, maybe. A chance to start over, to wash himself clean of the sins that clung to his soul like a shroud. Or maybe just another dead end, another shattered dream to add to the collection. It was impossible to say, here in the belly of the beast. The only thing he knew for sure was that he couldn't stop. Not now, not ever. He had to keep going, keep putting one foot in front of the other. For as long as it took, and then some. Until he found his way back to the light, or until the darkness swallowed him whole. Whichever came first, he would meet it head on. With nothing to shield him but his own stubborn will, and the love of a battered old hound who'd followed him to the ends of the earth and back again. It wasn't much. But out here, in the savage heart of the wild, it would have to be enough. The only thing Ricky knew for sure was that he was done running. Done hiding from the truth of what he was and what he'd done. Whatever happened next, he would face it like a man. Like the man he'd always hoped to be, beneath the fear and the doubt. The man he'd glimpsed in Scott's eyes, in those golden moments by the river. A good man. A brave man. A man who could look the darkness in the eye and not flinch away. That man was still in there somewhere. Buried deep, battered and bruised. But not broken. Not yet. And as long as there was breath in his body, Ricky would keep fighting to bring him back to the surface. To make him real, in a way he'd never been before. It was a long shot, he knew. The longest of long shots in a game that had always been rigged against him. But what choice did he have? What choice had he ever had, really? The only way out was through. And so, with Willie at his side and the taste of blood in his mouth, Ricky staggered on. Chapter 9. An Uncomfortable Evening. As darkness fell over the forest like a shroud, Ricky and Willie limped into the campsite where this nightmare had begun just hours before. Ricky's entire body throbbed with pain, his head pounding in time to his ragged breaths. But he pushed it aside, focused only on finding Scott and escaping this twisted game of cat and mouse. To his immense relief, Scott was there waiting for them, pacing anxiously in the flickering light of the campfire. When he caught sight of Ricky's battered face, he blanched, rushing over to steady him. "Jesus, Ricky, what happened to you? You look like you went 10 rounds with a grizzly." Ricky sagged against him, allowing himself a moment of weakness, now that relative safety was within reach. "Worse," he croaked. "Your old pal, the one with the tent, he jumped me, beat me to a pulp." Scott's eyes widened with shock and fury. "Sean, that psycho bastard is here." Ricky nodded grimly. "He's got it out for you bad, man. I don't know what went down between you two, but he's not gonna stop until one of you's dead." Scott cursed vehemently, running a hand over his haggard face. "I was afraid of this, Sean and I. We've got history, the bad kind." He guided Ricky over to a log by the fire, easing him down to sit. Ricky groaned as his abused muscles protested the movement. Scott crouched beside him, voice low and urgent. "Look, you don't need to get mixed up in this. Sean's my problem, not yours. Why don't you take Willie and get out of here? Get somewhere safe, I'll deal with him." But Ricky shook his head stubbornly, even as the world swam dizzyingly around him. "No way, I'm not leaving you out here alone with that maniac. We stick together, watch each other's backs. That's the only way either of us is getting out of this in one piece." Scott looked like he wanted to argue, but something in Ricky's gaze must have convinced him of the futility of it. He sighed heavily, clasping Ricky's shoulder. "All right, partner, we do this together. But I swear, if that son of a bitch lays another hand on you, I'll gut him like a deer." Ricky managed a weak grin at that. "Get in line." They set about securing the campsite as best they could, dousing the fire to avoid drawing attention and stowing their gear in case they needed to make a quick getaway. Scott filled Ricky in on his history with Sean in terse, clipped sentences. A toxic friendship turned rivalry, with bad blood festering on both sides. "I thought I'd seen the last of him years ago," Scott said grimly. "Guess I should have known better than to think I could outrun my past." Ricky just grunted in commiseration. He knew a thing or two about pasts that refused to stay buried. By the time they'd finished their preparations, full dark had fallen, the woods alive with the secret rustlings of nocturnal creatures. They sat with their backs to a broad oak tree, weapons close at hand, straining for any sound that might signal Sean's approach. But the night remained still and watchful, yielding no clues. The waiting was almost worse than another confrontation, the not knowing, the certainty that their hunter was out there somewhere, biding his time. Minutes crept by with agonizing slowness. Ricky's injuries throbbed and ached, exhaustion dragging at his bones. Beside him, Scott was a coiled spring of tension, jaw clenched so tight it looked like it might crack. They traded occasional murmurs, more for the comfort of hearing another human voice and out of any real need for conversation. Willie huddled miserably between them, still trembling from the earlier trauma. It was the small hours of the morning before Scott finally stirred, rising stiffly to his feet. "Screw this," he muttered. "I can't take any more of this sitting around, waiting to be attacked. We need to get moving, try to make it back to civilization." Ricky hesitated, torn between the desperate desire to put this place behind them and the fear of what might be waiting in the darkness beyond their small circle of safety. But in the end, he knew Scott was right. They couldn't stay here indefinitely, jumping at shadows. "Okay," he said wearily. "Okay, let's go." They gathered up only the essentials, leaving the rest of their gear scattered around the cold campsite. Ricky whistled softly for Willie, who glued himself to his side, a warm, reassuring presence in the chill of the night. Together they set off down the narrow trail, senses straining for any hint of danger. The forest closed in around them like a living thing, branches snatching at their clothes, roots threatening to trip them up at every turn. But they pushed on, leaning on each other when the going got tough, refusing to let the fear take them over. Chapter 10. A Startling Departure. They had been hiking for maybe an hour, picking their way carefully through the darkened woods when it happened. One moment, the night was still and silent around them, nothing but the hoot of an owl and the scurrying of small creatures in the underbrush. The next, a crack like a gunshot split the air, followed by a strangled cry of pain. Ricky whirled around just in time to see Scott stumble and go down hard, clutching at his leg. "Scott." Ricky rushed to his friend's side, heart in his throat. "What happened? Are you hit?" But even as the words left his mouth, he saw the dark stains spreading across Scott's jeans, the glint of metal protruding from his thigh. A hunting trap, half hidden in the loam and detritus of the forest floor. Ricky cursed himself for not being more careful, for letting his guard down even for a moment. Of course Sean would have set traps, lying in wait like a spider in his web. It was just the sort of sadistic game he'd get off on. Scott was panting harshly, face white with shock and agony. "Son of a bitch," he gritted out between clenched teeth. "Feels like that bastard took a chunk out of me." Ricky swallowed hard, trying to force down the panic clawing at his throat. He had to stay calm, had to think. Scott needed him now more than ever. Okay, just hold still," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Let me take a look." He crouched down beside Scott, gently prying his fingers away from the wound. The metal jaws of the trap were buried deep in the meat of his thigh, blood welling up around the vicious points. Ricky knew he had to get it off, and fast, before Scott bled out or went into shock. But even as he reached for the trap, intending to pry it open, a sound froze him in his tracks. A laugh, low and mocking, drifting out of the darkness like a curse. Well, looks like you boys ran into a spot of trouble." Ricky's head snapped up, heart pounding. There, standing at the edge of the trail, was Sean. He held a hunting rifle loosely in his hands, a cruel smile playing across his scarred face. "Sean," Scott spat, struggling to sit up. "You fucking psycho! I should have known you'd pull something like this." Sean just chuckled, taking a step forward. "Oh, Scotty, you always were too trusting for your own good. Didn't your mama ever tell you not to go wandering in the woods with strangers? Ricky rose slowly to his feet, putting himself between Sean and Scott. Listen, man, he said, trying to keep his voice calm and level. We don't want any trouble. Just let us go, and we'll forget this ever happened. But Sean just shook his head, that feral grin never leaving his face. See, now, I don't think I can do that. Me and Scotty here, we've got some unfinished business to take care of, and you just had the bad luck to get caught in the crossfire. He raised the rifle, pointing it directly at Ricky's chest. Ricky heard Scott suck in a sharp breath behind him, heard Willie start to growl low in his throat. But he didn't dare take his eyes off Sean, not for a second. You don't have to do this, Ricky said, fighting to keep his voice steady. We can still walk away from this, all of us. It's not too late. Sean just laughed, a cold, mirthless sound. Oh, but it is, friend. It's been too late for a long time now, see, the way I figure it. The only way this ends is with one of us in the ground, and I don't plan on it being me. Ricky's mind was racing, desperately searching for a way out. But he knew there was none. Sean had them dead to rights, wounded and helpless. It was only a matter of time before he pulled the trigger and ended this sick game once and for all. And then, just as Ricky was bracing himself for the inevitable, a strange thing happened. A sound split the night, a sound like nothing he had ever heard before. It was a howl, long and mournful and achingly sad. But there was something else in it too, something fierce and wild and defiant. Sean whirled around, eyes wide with shock and fear. What the hell was that? And then, before any of them could react, a shape came hurtling out of the darkness, a shape that resolved itself into the form of a huge, shaggy wolf. It slammed into Sean with the force of a freight train, knocking him to the ground and sending the rifle flying. Ricky watched in stunned disbelief as the wolf tore into Sean, fangs flashing, claws raking. Sean screamed, high and shrill, trying desperately to fend off the attack. But it was no use. The wolf was relentless, a force of nature, unstoppable. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, it was over. The wolf stepped back, muzzle dripping with blood, yellow eyes gleaming in the darkness. Sean lay still and silent on the forest floor, his chest a ruined mess of torn flesh and shattered bone. Ricky stared at the wolf, hardly daring to breathe. He knew he should be terrified, knew he should be running for his life. But somehow he wasn't. Somehow he felt nothing but a deep, bone-deep sense of relief. Because he knew with a certainty that defied explanation that this wolf was no ordinary predator. It was something more, something ancient and powerful and unutterably wise. A guardian spirit, perhaps, sent to watch over the wild places and those who wandered there. The wolf turned to look at him then, and Ricky felt a shiver run down his spine. There was something in those eyes, something knowing and almost human. It was as if the creature could see straight into his soul, could read every secret shame and hidden fear. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the wolf was gone, melting back into the shadows, as if it had never been there at all. Ricky blinked, wondering if he had imagined the whole thing, if it had all been some kind of fevered dream brought on by pain and exhaustion. But then he heard Scott groan behind him, heard Willie whine softly, and he knew it had been real. Sean was dead, torn to pieces by a creature out of legend. And he and Scott were alive, against all odds, against all hope. Ricky turned back to his friend, kneeling down beside him once more. "Scott," You still with me? Scott nodded weakly, face ashen, but eyes clear. Yeah, I'm here. What was that thing? Ricky shook his head, helping Scott to sit up. I don't know, but whatever it was, I think it just saved our lives. Scott glanced over at Sean's mangled corpse and shuddered. God, I can't believe he's really gone after all these years. Ricky squeezed his shoulder, feeling a rush of sympathy for his friend. No matter what bad blood lay between them, no one deserved an end like that. I know, he said quietly. But it's over now. We're safe. Scott nodded, leaning heavily against Ricky as they struggled to their feet. Yeah, I guess we are. They looked at each other then, two battered, bloodied survivors standing in the wreckage of their ordeal. And despite everything, despite the pain and the fear and the horror of what they had just been through, Ricky felt a rush of fierce, defiant joy. Because they had made it. Against all odds, against everything the wilderness and their own twisted pasts had thrown at them, they had come out the other side. Stronger, wiser, more alive than they had ever been before. And as they turned to limp off into the waiting dawn, Willie trotting faithfully at their heels, Ricky knew that something had changed between them, something fundamental and profound. They were no longer just two strangers thrown together by chance and circumstance. They were brothers now, bound by blood and sweat and shared trauma. And no matter what the future held, no matter where their paths might take them, that bond would never be broken. Chapter 11. A Cry for Help. The first fingers of dawn were just beginning to paint the sky in shades of pink and gold as Dorothy and Ann sat together in their cozy living room, sipping mugs of steaming coffee. It was their morning ritual, a chance to ease into the day with quiet conversation and companionable silence. But this morning, there was an undercurrent of unease running between them, a sense that something was not quite right with their little corner of the world. They had both been awakened in the night by strange noises coming from the woods behind their house, eerie howls and snarls that had sent shivers down their spines. I'm telling you, Dottie, there's something out there, Ann said, cradling her mug between her hands. Something unnatural. Dorothy frowned, staring out the window at the misty mountains beyond. I don't know, Annie, might have just been a coyote or maybe a bear. You know how they can sound when they're riled up. But even as she said it, she knew it wasn't true. Those sounds had been like nothing she had ever heard before, nothing any natural creature could make. It was as if the very wilderness itself had been crying out in pain and rage. She shook her head, trying to dispel the sense of foreboding that clung to her like a shroud. Anyway, there's no use worrying about it now. I'm sure whatever it was, it's long gone by. But before she could finish her sentence, a sound cut through the quiet morning like a knife. A banging at the door, urgent and insistent, like someone was trying to break it down. Dorothy and Ann looked at each other, eyes wide with fear. Oh my God, Ann whispered. You think, could it be? But Dorothy was already on her feet, moving towards the door with a determined set to her jaw. Only one way to find out, she said grimly. She took a deep breath, steeling herself for whatever horrors might lie on the other side, and flung open the door. And there, sprawled across the threshold in a growing pool of his own blood, was a man. He was young, no more than 30, with a shock of dark hair and a face that might have been handsome, if not for the stark terror etched across it. His clothes were torn and muddy, his skin crisscrossed with gashes and bruises. And everywhere, there was blood. Please, he croaked, reaching out a trembling hand. Help me. Dorothy dropped to her knees beside him, her heart hammering in her chest. "It's okay," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "It's okay. We've got you. What happened? Who did this to you?" The man shook his head, eyes rolling back in his head. "Trap," he mumbled. "In the woods, my friend. He's still out there." And then his eyes fluttered closed, and he went limp, his chest barely rising and falling with each shallow breath. Dorothy looked up at Anne, who was standing frozen in the doorway, her face white with shock. "Call 911, she said, her voice shaking. "Now." And nodded, fumbling for her phone with trembling hands. As she dialed, Dorothy turned her attention back to the man on the floor, checking for a pulse, trying to staunch the flow of blood with her own shirt. She didn't know who he was or what had happened to him out there in the woods. But she knew one thing for certain. Whatever darkness lurked in those hills, whatever evil had driven this poor soul to their doorstep, it was far from over. And as the sound of sirens began to wail in the distance, growing louder with each passing second, Dorothy felt a chill run down her spine. Because she knew deep in her bones that this was only the beginning, that the true horror of what had happened in those mountains was yet to be revealed. And that by the time it was all over, none of their lives would ever be the same again. Chapter 12. A Perilous Journey. Sheriff Walter Harding was not a man who believed in coincidences. In his 20 years on the force, he had seen too much, experienced too many strange and inexplicable things to chalk anything up to random chance. So when the call came in about a badly wounded hiker found on the doorstep of a remote mountain cabin, just hours after a series of bizarre and terrifying reports from the same area, he knew it was no accident. He gathered his men and set out immediately, sirens blaring, tires squealing on the narrow, winding roads. They were a motley crew, his deputies, all hard-bitten, no-nonsense types who had seen their share of action over the years. But even they seemed on edge as they sped towards the scene, faces grim and hands white-knuckled on their weapons. They all knew the stories about that particular stretch of wilderness, the dark legends and whispered rumors that had been passed down through generations of locals. Tales of strange creatures lurking in the shadows, of hikers who ventured off the trail and were never seen again. Most of them dismissed such talk as superstitious nonsense, the ramblings of old-timers with too much time on their hands. But Harding knew better. He had seen things out there in those woods, things that defied explanation or reason, things that still haunted his dreams and made him wake up in a cold sweat, heart pounding, and mouth dry with fear. And now it seemed those horrors had come calling once again. As they rounded a bend in the road, Harding caught a glimpse of flashing lights up ahead, an ambulance parked haphazardly on the shoulder, its rear doors flung wide open. His stomach clenched with dread at the sight. They screeched to a halt beside it, leaping from their vehicles with weapons drawn. Harding took point, motioning for his men to fan out behind him as he approached cautiously. The paramedics were huddled over a prone figure on a stretcher, presumably their bleed-out victim from the cabin up the road. But as soon as they saw that armed officers had arrived, one rose and moved over urgently. "What we got?" Harding demanded without preamble. "Trauma case, white male, early 60s best we can tell from age alone. By all rights, he should have already bled out given what looks like stab or bite wounds. But he's hanging tough somehow, so we packaged quick as we could so you could get him through to County General." "Any ID?" "Just this," one medic said grimly, holding up Ziploc heavy with a billfold and wallet, all dripping red. "Don't know how much help it'll be, though." Harding sighed heavily before addressing his men. "All right, boys, secure this scene ASAP, but I want it done quietly. Last thing we need right now is these woods crawling with looky-loos from town on top of whatever it is we're already dealing with out here." He turned next to another Deputy Atkins, former Army Ranger, who looked utterly unruffled by this grisly circumstance, despite this only being his second month with their department, gesturing at the idling ambulance about to embark. "You jump on board and go with. Take statements from those two ladies soon as Doe here gets tucked in over in the city. Don't leave anything out, understood?" "Yes, sir," Atkins said crisply with a nod, and moved swiftly rear cargo hold. Harding watched stoically those crimson-streaked doors flung shut, sealing up their victim inside, before that emergency vehicle tore off down that lonely road back, civilization sirens wailing as they went, swiftly disappearing distance, before eventually fading into oppressive quiet, once more leaving only vast stillness, primeval forest in its wake. He turned, looking up mountainside, where that cabin stood nestled, first responding officers already present, now moving about, shining high beams across exterior, checking for signs intruders, but he already knew they wouldn't find anything. Whomever or whatever had done this was undoubtedly long gone by time occupants had even phoned it in. But that didn't mean they were anywhere safe from it coming back to again either, not while still remaining so close ground zero, where it had all probably gone down only scant hours earlier. "No, sir, not by a country fucking mile." "Okay, gentlemen," Harding finally spoke up, addressing his team, gearing them up both physically and mentally for task at hand that lay ahead. "Nobody wanders off alone. We stick tight, watch each other's backs, only way any of us getting out of this thing alive, so don't do anything goddamn stupid trying play hero, because I guarantee that thing is still out there, somewhere watching us right now, just waiting for one of you dipshits make a wrong move. Are we absolutely clear on that much at least?" There came grim chorus affirmatives all around, accompanied by metallic clacking sounds as safeties were thumbed off and fresh magazines slapped home in preparation before they began moving together as a well-drilled unit deeper into those shadowed tree lines. Chapter 13. A Disturbing Discovery. The campsite was in shambles. That much was clear from the moment Harding and his men stepped into the clearing, flashlight beams cutting through the gloom like knives. Here was scattered everywhere, torn and bloodied, as if a wild animal had gone on a rampage. The remains of a fire smoldered in a ring of stones, wisps of smoke curling up into the night sky. And everywhere, there were signs of a desperate, brutal struggle. Harding moved forward cautiously, his heart pounding in his chest. He had seen his share of crime scenes over the years, but this was something else entirely. There was a savagery to the destruction, a sense of malevolent intent that made his skin crawl. He played his light over the ground, taking in the churned earth, the spattered droplets of crimson that painted the leaves and branches. Someone, or something, had been badly injured here, perhaps even killed. And yet there was no body, no sign of the victim, save for the gruesome aftermath of the attack. "Jesus Christ," one of his deputies muttered, his face pale in the moonlight. "What the hell happened here?" Harding shook his head, trying to make sense of the chaos. "I don't know," he said grimly. "But whatever it wasn't natural. This was no animal attack." He moved deeper into the campsite, stepping carefully around the scattered debris. And then he saw it, half hidden beneath a torn and bloodied sleeping bag. A wallet, its leather stained and sticky with gore. Harding crouched down, his heart in his throat, and flipped it open with the tip of his pen. And there, staring up at him from a driver's license photo, was a face he had hoped never to see again. Randall Lee Smith. The name sent a shiver down Harding's spine, conjuring up memories of a horrific case from years before. Smith had been a local legend, a bogeyman parents used to scare their children into behaving. A twisted, feral creature who lurked in the mountains, preying on the unwary and the innocent. He had been responsible for a string of brutal murders, each one more heinous than the last. Hikers and campers who had ventured too far off the beaten path, only to meet a grisly end at the hands of a madman. Harding had been a young deputy then, green and eager to prove himself. He had been part of the manhunt that had finally brought Smith to justice, or so they had thought. But the man had proven more cunning than anyone had given him credit for. He had slipped away in the night, vanishing into the wilderness like a ghost. And for years, he had been a phantom, a specter that haunted the dark corners of Harding's mind. The one that got away, the monster that still lurked in the shadows. But now it seemed that Smith had returned, and he had brought his madness and his violence with him, unleashing it on a new generation of victims. Harding felt a surge of rage and disgust at the thought. He stood up, tucking the wallet into an evidence bag with shaking hands. "It's him," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Randall Lee Smith, the sick bastard who terrorized these mountains all those years ago. He's back." His men looked at him with a mixture of horror and disbelief. They had all heard the stories, of course. The tales of the mad mountain man who preyed on the innocent. But to have it confirmed, to know that he was out there again, stalking the hills and hollers like a predator, it was almost too much to bear. Harding took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. He knew what he had to do now. He had to find Smith, had to put an end to his reign of terror once and for all. No matter what it took, no matter how far he had to go, or what risks he had to take. He owed it to the victims, to their families, to the memory of all those who had suffered at Smith's hands. And he owed it to himself, to the young deputy who had sworn an oath to serve and protect, no matter the cost. He turned to his men, his eyes hard and determined. "All right," he said, his voice ringing out in the stillness of the night. "Here's what we're going to do. We're going to search this whole goddamn mountain, top to bottom. We're going to turn over every rock, look behind every tree, until we find this son of a bitch. And when we do, we're going to make sure he never hurts anyone ever again. Are you with me?" There was a moment of silence, a hesitation. And then as one, his men nodded grimly, their faces set with the same fierce determination that burned in Harding's heart. "Yes, sir," they said, their voices low and steady. "We're with you." Harding nodded, a grim smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Then let's get to work," he said. "We've got a monster to catch." And with that, they set off into the darkness, their flashlights bobbing like fireflies in the night, their footsteps echoing through the silent, watchful forest. The hunt was on, and heaven help anyone who stood in their way. Chapter 14. The Notorious Randall Lee Smith. The name hung in the air like a curse, a malevolent specter that sent shivers down the spines of all who heard it. Randall Lee Smith, the mad mountain man, the bogeyman of the Appalachians. A twisted, feral creature who had haunted these hills for decades, leaving a trail of blood and terror in his wake. Harding remembered the first time he had heard the name, back when he was just a rookie deputy fresh out of the academy. It had been whispered around the station like a dark secret, a cautionary tale passed down from the old-timers to the new blood. "Watch yourself out there, kid," they had said, their eyes haunted and their voices low. Randall Lee's still out there somewhere, waiting for his chance, He'll gut you like a deer if you're not careful." Harding had laughed it off at the time, confident in his own abilities and the power of his badge. But as the years went by and the stories continued to pile up, he began to realize that there was more to the legend than mere superstition and exaggeration. Smith was a real man, flesh and blood, but he was something more than that too. He was a force of nature, a primal embodiment of the darkness that lurked in the heart of the wilderness. A creature of pure, malevolent evil that preyed on the weak and the innocent with a savage, insatiable hunger. He had been born in these mountains, or so the stories went. The bastard son of a backwoods preacher and a woman of ill repute, raised in squalor and neglect. From an early age, he had shown a propensity for violence and cruelty, torturing animals and bullying the other children in his isolated mountain community. As he grew older, his appetites and his madness only seemed to increase. He became a loner, a drifter who roamed the hills and hollers like a ghost, living off the land and shunning human contact. But every now and then, he would emerge from his self-imposed exile to strike at the unwary and the vulnerable. Hikers, campers, anyone who ventured too far off the beaten path was fair game for Smith's twisted desires. He would stalk them for days, watching from the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And when he did, the results were almost too horrific to contemplate. Harding had seen the crime scene photos, had read the autopsy reports. The things that Smith had done to his victims, it was the stuff of nightmares. Mutilations, dismemberments, acts of such savage brutality that they defied description or understanding. And yet, despite the best efforts of law enforcement, Smith had always managed to stay one step ahead of them. He was like a ghost, a phantom who could disappear into the wilderness without a trace, only to resurface months or even years later to claim another victim. It had become an obsession for Harding, a personal crusade to bring the monster to justice once and for all. He had pored over every scrap of evidence, followed up on every lead, no matter how tenuous or far-fetched. But always, Smith had eluded him, slipping away into the shadows like a wraith. Until now. Now it seemed the Mad Mountain Man had finally made a mistake. He had left something behind at his latest killing ground, a clue that could lead Harding and his men right to his doorstep. The sheriff felt a surge of grim determination as he studied the blood-stained wallet in his hands, the driver's license photo staring back at him with cold, dead eyes. This was it, he knew. This was his chance to put an end to Smith's reign of terror once and for all. He would not rest until the monster was behind bars or in the ground. He would not let the ghosts of the past haunt him any longer, would not let the weight of his own failure crush him into despair. He was a man on a mission now, a hunter with his prey firmly in his sights. And he would not stop, would not falter, until justice had been served and the nightmare of Randall Lee Smith was nothing more than a fading memory. He turned to his men, his eyes hard and his jaw set with determination. "Let's move," he said, his voice a low, menacing growl. "We've got work to do." And with that, they set off into the darkness once more, their hearts pounding and their blood singing with the thrill of the chase. The hunt was on, and heaven help the monster who stood in their way. Chapter 15. A Sinister Deception. Ricky drifted in and out of consciousness, his mind a haze of pain and confusion. He could feel the rough ground beneath him, the cold night air on his skin. But beyond that, everything was a blur, a jumble of disjointed images and half-remembered horrors. He remembered the campsite, the feeling of unease that had crept over him as he and Scott had settled in for the night. He remembered the stranger who had appeared out of nowhere, the cruel sneer on his face, and the malevolence in his eyes. And he remembered the attack, the sudden explosion of violence that had shattered the peace of the evening like a thunderclap. The sickening crunch of bone, the hot splash of blood on his face. The frenzied, animalistic savagery of it all, the sheer, primal brutality. He had fought back, of course. Had lashed out with all the strength and fury he could muster, desperate to protect himself and his friend from the madman who had set upon them. But it had been no use. The stranger was too strong, too fast, too utterly ruthless in his assault. And then there had been the wolf. The great, shaggy beast that had burst out of the darkness like a force of nature, all fangs and fury and primal, unchecked rage. It had torn into the stranger with a savagery that made Ricky's blood run cold, ripping and tearing and shredding until there was nothing left but a broken, bloodied husk. He had watched it all unfold through a haze of pain and shock, his mind reeling from the sheer, surreal horror of it all. And then the darkness had claimed him, dragging him down into a black, bottomless void from which there seemed to be no escape. But now he was awake again, his eyes fluttering open to take in his surroundings with a growing sense of dread. He was still in the campsite, still lying on the cold, hard ground where he had fallen. But something was different. Something was wrong. The stranger's body was gone, vanished without a trace. And in its place, lying just a few feet away from him, was a sight that made Ricky's blood run cold with horror and despair. It was Scott, his friend, his partner, the man who had stood by his side through thick and thin. He was lying there, still and silent, his eyes staring sightlessly up at the star-strewn sky. And he was dead. There was no doubt about that. His throat had been torn out, his chest cavity ripped open and hollowed out like a gutted fish. Blood pooled around him in a dark, glistening pool, soaking into the earth like some sort of obscene offering. Ricky felt a scream building in his throat, a howl of anguish and denial that threatened to tear him apart from the inside out. This couldn't be happening, he thought wildly. It had to be some sort of nightmare, some sort of twisted, fevered dream conjured up by his battered and traumatized mind. But deep down, he knew the truth. Scott was gone, murdered by the same madmen who had attacked them both. And Ricky had been powerless to stop it, powerless to save the one person in the world who had ever truly understood him. He dragged himself to his feet, his body screaming in protest with every movement. He had to get out of here, had to find help, had to do something, anything, to make sense of this nightmare that had swallowed him whole. But as he stumbled forward, his eyes caught on something lying on the ground, just a few feet away. Something that made his heart seize up in his chest and his breath catch in his throat. It was a wallet. A battered, blood-stained wallet that had fallen from the pocket of the stranger's shredded clothing. And sticking out of it, plain as day, was a driver's license. A driver's license with Ricky's own face staring back at him. His name, his address, his date of birth. Everything about him laid out in stark, undeniable black and white. And in that moment, Ricky felt the world tilt on its axis, felt reality itself come unmoored and go spinning off into the void. Because he knew, with a sickening, soul-crushing certainty, what this meant. The stranger hadn't been a stranger at all. He had been Ricky himself, or some twisted, nightmarish version of him. A doppelganger, a dark reflection of his own worst impulses and deepest fears. And the wolf had been his own creation too, a manifestation of the primal animalistic rage that lurked within him, just waiting to be unleashed upon the world. He had done this. He had killed his own best friend, had torn him apart like a rabid beast, and he had done it all without even realizing it, lost in some sort of dissociative fugue state that had turned him into a monster. Ricky felt his knees give out from under him, felt the cold, hard ground rise up to meet him once again. And as he lay there, staring up at the uncaring stars, he knew that there was no coming back from this. He was lost, damned, a creature of the night forever doomed to wander the wilderness in search of new prey to sate his unnatural hungers. The world would never be safe from him again, never be free from the shadow of the mad mountain man who wore his face. And as the darkness closed in around him once more, as the wolf within him began to stir and howl for blood, Ricky could only laugh. A high, keening laugh that echoed through the mountains like the cry of a damned soul. Because in the end, that was all he was now. A ghost, a monster, a thing that should not be. And heaven help anyone who crossed his path from this night forward. Chapter 16. A Desperate Escape. Sean stumbled through the underbrush, his breath coming in ragged gasps, and his vision swimming with pain and exhaustion. He could feel the blood soaking through his shirt, the steady, pulsing flow of it that threatened to drain the life from his body with every passing second. But he couldn't stop, couldn't rest. Not now, not when Scott's life hung in the balance. His friend was out there somewhere, alone and injured, at the mercy of the madmen who had attacked them both. Randall Lee Smith. The name made Sean's skin crawl, sent a shiver of dread down his spine. He had heard the stories, of course. Everyone in these parts had. The tales of the twisted, feral mountain man who preyed on the innocent and the unwary with a savage, insatiable hunger. But he had never truly believed them, had always dismissed them as nothing more than campfire tales and old wives' gossip. Until tonight. Until he had seen the man anew, the monster, with his own eyes, had felt the white-hot agony of his blade as it carved into his flesh. It had all happened so fast, so suddenly. One moment, they had been sitting around the campfire, trading stories and sipping whiskey, the very picture of backcountry camaraderie. And the next had been a blur of blood and screams and primal, animalistic savagery. Smith had come out of nowhere, a wraith in human form, all cold eyes and cruel, sneering lips. He had set upon them, like a wild beast, hacking and slashing with a ruthless, single-minded fury that defied all reason or mercy. Sean had fought back, of course, had lashed out with all the strength and skill he could muster, desperate to protect himself and his friend from the madman who had invaded their camp. But it had been like trying to fight a force of nature, like standing against a hurricane or a wildfire. Smith was too fast, too strong, too utterly relentless in his assault. He shrugged off blows that would have felled a lesser man, laughed off wounds that would have left anyone else writhing in agony on the ground. It was as if he was possessed, driven by some dark and twisted power that made him more than human. And in the end, it had been all Sean could do to grab Scott and run, to flee into the night like frightened rabbits before the wolf that hunted them. He had half carried, half dragged his friend through the undergrowth, ignoring the searing pain in his own body, the hot, sticky blood that poured from a dozen wounds. All that mattered was getting away, putting as much distance as possible between them and the monster that pursued them. But even as he ran, Sean knew that it was only a matter of time before Smith caught up to them. The man was a predator, a hunter born and bred, and he would not rest until he had claimed his prey. And so Sean had made a decision, a desperate gamble born of equal parts desperation and self-sacrifice. He had propped Scott up against a tree, had whispered a few last, frantic instructions in his ear. And then he had taken off running again, deliberately making as much noise as possible, leaving a clear trail for Smith to follow. It was a suicide mission, he knew. A doomed attempt to buy his friend a few precious minutes of safety and respite. But what choice did he have? Scott was in no condition to run, no condition to fight. If Sean didn't do something, didn't act as a decoy and a distraction, then they were both as good as dead. And so he ran, crashing through the brush like a wounded animal, his heart pounding in his ears and his breath coming in ragged gasps. He could hear Smith behind him, could feel the man's presence like a physical weight on his back, drawing ever closer with each passing second. But somehow, miraculously, he managed to stay ahead of him, managed to keep pushing himself forward even as his body screamed in protest and his vision began to blur at the edges. He ran until his lungs burned and his legs felt like lead weights, until the taste of blood was thick in his mouth and the world around him had faded into a haze of pain and exhaustion. And then, just when he thought he could go no further, just when he was sure that Smith's blade would find his back at any moment, he saw it. A light in the distance, a flickering beacon of hope shining through the trees like a promise of salvation. It was a house, he realized dimly. A lone cabin nestled in a clearing at the base of a wooded hillside. And in that moment, Sean knew that it was his only chance, his last desperate hope of survival. He put on a final, frenzied burst of speed, ignoring the agony that lanced through his battered body with every step. He could hear Smith behind him, could feel the man's hot breath on the back of his neck, could almost sense the hungry anticipation in his cruel, dead eyes. But he didn't look back, didn't dare to glance over his shoulder for fear of what he might see. He just kept running, kept pushing himself forward until he was stumbling up the steps of the cabin's porch, his fist pounding frantically against the weathered wood of the door. "Help me," he gasped out, his voice little more than a hoarse, desperate whisper. "Please, God, someone help me." And then the door was swinging open, and he was falling forward into the warm, welcoming light of the cabin's interior. He caught a glimpse of startled faces, heard the sharp intake of breath and the murmur of concerned voices. But he was beyond caring, beyond any thought or feeling, beyond the all-consuming need to escape the nightmare that had swallowed him whole. He collapsed to the floor in a boneless heap, his vision swimming and his mind slipping away into a black, bottomless void. The last thing he heard before the darkness claimed him was the sound of footsteps on the porch behind him, the creak of floorboards as someone, or something, approached the open doorway. And then, nothing. Nothing but the blissful, empty silence of oblivion and the fading memory of a monster's haunted, hungry eyes. Chapter 17. A Tragic End. Sheriff Harding stood over the body, his face grim and his eyes hard as flint. He had seen a lot of death in his time, a lot of violence and brutality. But this was something else entirely. Randall Lee Smith lay on the floor of his cell, his eyes staring sightlessly up at the ceiling, and his mouth twisted into a rictus grin of cruel, sneering triumph. He was dead, that much was clear. His chest was still and unmoving, his skin already taking on the waxy, grayish pallor of a corpse. But it was the manner of his death that made Harding's stomach turn, that sent a shiver of dread down his spine. There was no sign of struggle, no indication of foul play or external trauma. It was as if the man had simply stopped, as if some unseen force had reached into his chest and squeezed the life out of him like a ripe fruit. The sheriff shook his head, trying to make sense of it all. It had only been a few hours since they had brought Smith in, since they had finally caught up to the monster who had terrorized these mountains for so long. They had tracked him to a remote cabin deep in the woods, had surrounded the place, and demanded his surrender. But Smith had not gone quietly. He had fought like a cornered animal, lashing out with a savagery and a fury that had left 2 of Harding's men bleeding on the ground. It had taken a dozen officers to subdue him, to wrestle him into cuffs, and drag him kicking and screaming to the waiting patrol car. And even then, even as they had thrown him into the back seat and slammed the door shut behind him, Smith had not stopped laughing. A high, keening cackle that had echoed through the night like the cry of a damned soul. Harding had thought that he would never forget that sound, that it would haunt his dreams for the rest of his days. But now it seemed like a distant memory, a half-forgotten nightmare that paled in comparison to the grim reality before him. He turned to the officer standing beside him, his voice low and tight with barely suppressed anger. "What happened here?" he demanded. "How the hell did this happen?" The man shook his head, his face pale and his eyes wide with shock and disbelief. "I don't know, sir," he said. "He was fine when we brought him in, kicking and screaming the whole way. We put him in the cell, locked the door behind him, and then, a few hours later, we found him like this." Harding cursed under his breath, his mind racing as he tried to make sense of it all. It didn't add up, didn't make any sense at all. Smith had been healthy, strong, full of a twisted, malevolent vitality that had seemed almost inhuman. How could he have just died? Without any warning, without any apparent cause. And then it hit him, a sickening realization that made his blood run cold in his veins. The answer was staring him right in the face, as plain and undeniable as the corpse at his feet. Smith hadn't just died. He had been killed, murdered by the same dark, twisted power that had driven him to commit such unspeakable atrocities in the first place. A power that even now, even in death, seemed to cling to him like a shroud, a miasma of evil that made the air thick and heavy with dread. Harding remembered the stories he had heard, the whispered legends that spoke of the mountain man's unholy pact with the forces of darkness, of the blood sacrifices he had made, the innocent lives he had taken in exchange for unnatural strength and vitality. And now it seemed that those same forces had come to collect their due, that they had reached out from beyond the grave to claim the soul of their loyal servant, to drag him down into the black, bottomless pit of damnation that awaited all those who trafficked with the powers of hell. The sheriff felt a shiver run down his spine, a cold, creeping dread that made his skin crawl and his heart hammer in his chest. He had thought that catching Smith would be the end of it, that putting the monster behind bars would finally bring some measure of peace and closure to the people of these mountains. But now he realized that it was only the beginning, that the true horror of Randall Lee Smith's legacy was just beginning to unfold, a dark and twisted tale that would haunt these hills for generations to come. And as he stood there, staring down at the madman's grinning, lifeless face, Harding knew that he would do whatever it took to unravel the mystery, to follow the trail of blood and darkness wherever it might lead. Even if it meant facing the monsters that lurked in the shadows of his own soul, the demons that whispered in the dark corners of his mind. Even if it meant sacrificing everything he held dear, everything that made him human. Because in the end, that was the price of justice, the cost of keeping the innocent safe from the things that went bump in the night. And Harding was willing to pay it, no matter how high the toll might be. He turned to his men, his eyes hard and his jaw set with grim determination. "Secure the scene," he said, his voice ringing out in the stillness of the cell block. "I want every inch of this place searched, every scrap of evidence bagged and tagged. We're going to get to the bottom of this, one way or another." And with that, he strode out into the night, his mind already racing ahead to the challenges that lay before him. The hunt was on, and heaven help anyone who stood in his way. Chapter 18. Unraveling the Mystery. The next few days passed in a blur of activity, a frenzied whirlwind of interviews and interrogations, of crime scene analysis and forensic reports. Sheriff Harding threw himself into the investigation with a single-minded intensity, a fierce, unrelenting determination to unravel the tangled web of secrets and lies that surrounded Randall Lee Smith's final, grisly end. He pored over every scrap of evidence, every shred of testimony, looking for the pieces that would make the puzzle fall into place. He questioned everyone who had ever had contact with the mountain man, from the frightened hikers who had stumbled across his bloody handiwork to the grizzled old-timers who whispered tales of his dark and twisted deeds. But no matter how deep he dug, no matter how far he pushed, the answers seemed to slip through his fingers like smoke, like wisps of fog that vanished in the cold, clear light of day. There were no leads, no clues, no trace of the unholy power that had claimed Smith's life and left his corpse grinning in the darkness of his cell. Until, one day, a break in the case. A young deputy, fresh-faced and eager to prove himself, came to Harding with a discovery that made the sheriff's blood run cold in his veins. "Sir," the man said, his voice trembling with barely suppressed excitement, "I think you need to see this." He held out a plastic evidence bag, the contents gleaming dully in the harsh fluorescent light of the station. It was a cassette tape, the kind that Harding hadn't seen in years, the kind that had long since been replaced by digital files and streaming services. But it wasn't the outdated technology that made the sheriff's heart skip a beat, that sent a shiver of dread down his spine. It was the label, scrawled in Smith's unmistakable hand, a jagged, spidery script that seemed to writhe and twist on the yellowed paper. "Rituals," it read. And beneath that, a date, a time, a place. The coordinates of a remote clearing deep in the heart of the mountains, a place that Harding knew all too well. He had been there before, had seen the twisted, gnarled trees that seemed to reach out with clawed fingers to snatch at the unwary, had felt the oppressive weight of the darkness that hung over the place like a shroud, a miasma of evil that made the air thick and heavy with dread. It was a place of power, a nexus of dark and terrible energies that pulsed and throbbed like a living thing. A place where the veil between worlds was thin, where the borders between the living and the dead, the natural and the supernatural, blurred and shifted like the shadows at the edge of a dying fire. And now it seemed that Smith had been drawn there too, had been called by the same dark forces that had claimed his life and left his soul to rot in the pit of damnation. Called to perform some unspeakable rite, some blasphemous sacrament that would open the gates of hell and unleash the horrors that lurked within. Harding felt a chill run down his spine, a cold, creeping dread that made his skin crawl and his heart hammer in his chest. He knew that he had to go there, had to follow the trail of blood and darkness to its source. Had to confront the evil that lurked at the heart of the mystery, the malevolent power that had touched Smith's life and left its mark on the world. But he also knew that it would be a journey into the heart of darkness, a descent into the very depths of the abyss, that he would be tested in ways he had never been tested before, would face horrors that would make even the bravest man quail in terror. And yet he had no choice. He was the sheriff, the guardian of the innocent, the one who stood between the light and the shadows. If he didn't go, if he didn't face the darkness head-on, then who would? He took the tape from the deputy's hand, his fingers trembling slightly as they closed around the plastic. He could feel the weight of it, the cold, hard reality of the task that lay before him. But he also felt a flicker of something else, a fierce, unquenchable spark of determination that burned in his chest like a flame. A resolve to see this through to the end, to face whatever horrors lay in wait and emerge victorious on the other side. Because that was what it meant to be a lawman, to wear the badge and carry the gun. To stand against the darkness, no matter the cost, no matter the sacrifice. And so, with a deep breath and a silent prayer, Sheriff Harding stepped out into the night, the cassette tape clutched tight in his hand. The hunt was on, and heaven help anyone who stood in his way. Chapter 19. Unanswered Questions. Sean sat at his kitchen table, the files and photographs spread out before him like a macabre jigsaw puzzle. He had been over them 100 times, 1,000 times, searching for the piece that would make it all fall into place, that would finally bring some measure of closure to the nightmare that had consumed his life. But no matter how hard he looked, no matter how deep he dug, the answers seemed to elude him, slipping through his fingers like grains of sand in an hourglass. There were too many questions, too many loose ends, that refused to be tied up in a neat little bow. Why had Randall Lee Smith targeted them that night, out of all the hikers and campers who wandered through these mountains? What had drawn him to their campsite, to the flickering circle of firelight that had seemed like such a haven in the darkness? And what about the strange, guttural chanting that could be heard on the cassette tape, the eerie, otherworldly sounds that made the hair on the back of Sean's neck stand on end? What dark and terrible rituals had Smith been performing out there in the wilderness? What unholy pacts had he made with the forces of evil? But most of all, Sean couldn't stop thinking about the women, the ones whose photographs had been found in Smith's hidden stash, the ones whose faces stared out at him from the glossy paper, their eyes wide and haunted, their mouths twisted into silent screams. Who were they? Where had they come from? And what had happened to them, out there in the dark and lonely places where the mountain man had roamed? Sean knew that he might never find the answers, that the truth might be lost forever in the mists of time and memory. But still, he couldn't let it go, couldn't stop picking at the scab of his own trauma, his own guilt and regret. Because in a way, he felt responsible for those women, for their suffering and their fear. He had been the one who had escaped, who had stumbled to safety and left the others to their fate. He had been the one who had lived to tell the tale, while they had vanished into the void, their stories untold and their names unknown. And so he kept digging, kept searching, even as the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months. He talked to anyone who would listen, anyone who might have a scrap of information or a shred of insight into the mind of a monster. But in the end, it was all for naught. The trail went cold, the leads dried up, and the questions remained unanswered. Smith had taken his secrets to the grave, and the women were lost forever, their fates sealed in blood and darkness. And yet, even as the hope of resolution faded, even as the weight of his own failure pressed down upon him like a stone, Sean couldn't bring himself to give up. Couldn't bring himself to let go of the quest that had consumed him, body and soul. Because in a way, it was all he had left. The only thing that gave his life meaning, that kept him going in the face of the darkness that threatened to swallow him whole. The only thing that reminded him that he was still alive, still fighting, even when all seemed lost. And so he carried on, day after day, night after night, poring over the files, chasing down the leads, searching for the truth that seemed to dance just out of reach. It was a lonely quest, a bitter and thankless one, but it was his, and he would see it through to the end. No matter how long it took, no matter what it cost him, he owed it to the women, to the ones who had been lost. He owed it to himself, to the man he had once been, before the darkness had touched his life and left its mark upon his soul. And so Sean sat at his kitchen table, the weight of the years pressing down upon him like a shroud. The questions swirled in his mind, the doubts and the fears and the regrets. But beneath it all, deeper than the pain and the sorrow, there was a flicker of something else. A fierce, unquenchable spark of determination, a refusal to let the darkness win. Because in the end, that was all any of us could do. Stand fast against the night, even when all hope seemed lost. Keep fighting, keep believing, keep searching for the light that seemed to dance just out of reach. It was a hard truth, a bitter pill to swallow. But it was the only truth that mattered, the only thing that could keep the monsters at bay. And Sean would cling to it with all his might, with every fiber of his being. Until the very end. Until the darkness claimed him, or until he found his way back to the light. Chapter 20. Resilience and Recovery. The sun was just beginning to peek over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, as Sean and Scott made their way down the winding trail. The early morning air was crisp and cool, the dew still clinging to the leaves and the grass, and the only sound was the soft crunch of their boots against the earth. It had been a long and difficult journey getting to this point. The physical wounds had healed, the scars fading to pale, silvery lines against their skin. But the mental scars, those ran deeper, etched into their very souls like the jagged lines of a shattered mirror. For a long time, they had avoided this place, this stretch of wilderness that held so many painful memories. The thought of returning, of facing the ghosts that lurked in the shadows of the trees, it had been too much to bear, too raw and too real. But as the years passed, as the weight of the trauma began to lift, ever so slightly, they found themselves drawn back, like moths to a flame. Back to the place where it had all begun, where their lives had been forever changed by the touch of evil. And so they had come, step by painful step, mile by arduous mile, retracing the path that had led them to the heart of darkness, to the very edge of the abyss. It had been a journey of healing, of facing the fears that had haunted them for so long, and of finding the strength to move forward, to leave the past behind and embrace the future that lay ahead. Now, as they crested the final rise and looked out over the valley below, Sean felt a sense of peace wash over him, a calm and a clarity that he hadn't felt in years. The mountains stretched out before them, vast and wild and beautiful, the morning sun casting a golden glow over the peaks and the valleys. And in that moment, he knew that they had made the right choice. That coming back here, facing the demons that had haunted them for so long, it had been the only way forward, the only path to true healing. Because the wilderness, for all its dangers and its darkness, it was also a place of beauty, of wonder and awe. A place where the soul could find solace, where the heart could find peace. A place where even the deepest wounds could begin to heal, if only given the chance. And that was what they had done, he and Scott. They had given themselves that chance, had stepped out into the unknown, and faced their fears head-on. They had walked through the valley of the shadow, and emerged on the other side, stronger, wiser, more alive than they had ever been before. It hadn't been easy. There had been moments of doubt, of fear and despair. Times when the darkness had seemed too deep, the road too long and too hard. But they had persevered, had leaned on each other, and on the strength that they had found within themselves. And now they were here, standing on the edge of a new beginning, a new chapter in the story of their lives. The past would always be with them, the scars and the memories a part of who they were. But it didn't define them, didn't hold them back or weigh them down. They were survivors, he and Scott, warriors of the wild, forged in the crucible of pain and fear and loss. They had walked through the fire and emerged tempered and true, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. And as they stood there, shoulder to shoulder in the golden light of dawn, Sean knew that they would face those challenges together, that they would stand fast against the darkness, no matter what form it took, no matter how deep its shadows grew. Because that was what it meant to be alive, to be human in a world that was often cruel and uncaring. To keep going, even when all seemed lost. To find the light within and let it guide them through the night. And so, with a deep breath and a silent prayer, Sean and Scott stepped forward into the unknown. The trail stretched out before them, winding and twisting through the mountains like a ribbon of hope and promise. And though the journey ahead would be long and hard, fraught with danger and uncertainty, they knew that they would face it head-on with courage and resolve. Because they were survivors. And in the end, that was all that mattered. The end.